March's Career Advice Series webinar, Elevate Your Awareness, Enhance Your Practice. The ABA Career Advice Series is a monthly webinar series that contains practical tips on job search and professional development issues for seasoned and newer lawyers alike. Experienced career experts serving on the ABA Legal Career Central Board host the hour-long webinars at 1 p.m. Eastern on the second Friday of each month. Be sure to tune in next month for a webinar, Finding Long-Term Career Satisfaction Through Career Fit, moderated by ABA Legal Career Central Board member and Lawyer Brain LCC's Dr. Larry Richard, fan favorite. The Career Advice Series is produced by ABA Legal Career Central, which is created to serve as the predominant reservoir of information and inspiration for pre-law, law students, and lawyers everywhere, dispensing advice through publications, posting, and programming. It's also home of the ABA Job Board, where you can upload your resume for employer passive browsing and get a head start on finding your next job. A couple of housekeeping items before we start. We have handouts, so if you go to the handout section of your webinar panel, you can download a copy of the webinar PowerPoint presentation, and also a handy resource page that our panelists put together so that you can go a little bit deeper into mindfulness. I also want to mention, just because it's a common question that we get, that this is not a CLE webinar. It's just something we do every month to help you grow your legal skill set. So just as a mention. So with that, we're very pleased to have Susan Fine moderating today's discussion. Susan is the Director of Professional Development at the George Washington University Law School, an ABA Legal Career Central Board member and frequent speaker on law student professional development topics. Susan is also current co-chair and immediate past chair of the NALP Law Student Professional Development Section and a member of the Professional Development Consortium. She's a graduate of University of Michigan Law School and a member of the District of Columbia Bar. And with that, I'll turn it over to Susan to introduce today's program and our distinguished faculty.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Bill, for the introduction. We have a very distinguished panel here today to talk to you about mindfulness and the practice of law. And this is a hot topic in legal education and the profession, and has received a lot of attention lately, both in the academic literature and in the popular press. So I'm very pleased to welcome today Professor Rhonda Magee, one of the country's foremost experts on this topic. She teaches courses in contemplative law and mindfulness in the law at the University of San Francisco School of Law. And also joining us today is Martha Pacold, who's a partner in the Chicago law firm, and she incorporates mindfulness practices into her daily work, and she also teaches professional responsibility. We also have Denise Robinson, who combines her expertise in diversity and inclusion with teaching mindfulness to lawyers and law students. And thank you all so much for participating.
Thank you. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. So this is what we'll be covering in today's program. It's the what, the why, and the how of mindfulness. And you can send us your questions as you think of them, and we will be saving time to answer them at the end. But first off, we'd like to find out about your experience with a quick poll. So how would you describe your familiarity with mindfulness? And you can let us know where you are on this spectrum.
Give folks a few seconds to fill out these answers.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody. Hopefully everybody just can see the results now. Susan, is that right?
Right. I don't see the results, Bill.
Let's try. Sorry, this is the first poll that we've done with this series. Can you see them now?
Yeah, I see them now. So we have a range here with most people are somewhat familiar, and that's great. And we'll be sure to tailor our discussion so that it's of interest to everybody, no matter what your familiarity level is. Okay. So let's begin by getting on the same page with the term mindfulness. So we'll go to the next slide. Okay, here we go. So what is mindfulness? What isn't it? And who can practice mindfulness? And I'm going to turn first to Denise Robinson. Denise, would you like to give us some background?
Sure. Thank you so much, Susan. And thanks to everyone for participating in our poll. So I'm going to start with the easier parts of Susan's question. starting with the fact that mindfulness is for everyone. It is an accessible practice. It can be practiced in myriad ways. And that's part of the reason why, I think anyway, it has caught on so much in the mainstream because it is so accessible. Mindfulness certainly has spiritual roots, but mindfulness as a concept or a practice is not itself a belief system or a religion. So that's a common, I think, misconception that we can just dispel right here and now, that we're not talking about a religion here, but instead we're talking about a capacity. And I'll get into that in just a moment. But first, I'd like to draw your attention to the quote that's at the top of the screen here. And this comes from Jon Kabat-Zinn, who is a PhD biologist by training and professor emeritus at the UMass Medical School. He is the creator of the Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction Program, which is a widely used mindfulness program that draws on ancient practices as well as various scientific disciplines to address a variety of health conditions related to stress. Mindfulness-based stress reduction has been studied extensively, and a lot of the benefits of mindfulness that we'll be discussing throughout this presentation have been based upon studies of the application of the mindfulness-based stress reduction approach. He is part of the reason why, and this particular program is part of the reason why you hear a lot about mindfulness today. He certainly has contributed significantly to the growing interest and discussion of mindfulness in the mainstream. And some of you may have even seen him recently on 60 Minutes. So you have the quote there, and I'm just going to try to paraphrase it a bit and then unpack it. When I think of mindfulness, I characterize it as a capacity developed by practice of attending to or being aware of the present moment with a non-judgmental focus. And then another definition that I'm fond of from another respected scientist in this arena, his name is Dr. Dan Siegel, he's out of UCLA. He's been quoted as saying, mindfulness in a general sense is about waking up from life on automatic. All of us can probably relate to the experience of being on automatic pilot, such as the often cited example of driving home from somewhere and not even really being aware of how you got there. So we'll get into what mindfulness feels like in just a moment. We're going to do a practice together. But for now, let me just unpack what we mean by present moment awareness and non-judgmental focus, because those are the pieces of the definition that you'll probably hear come up a number of times during today's presentation. So the session title today, Elevate Your Awareness, Enhance Your Practice. When we talk about awareness in the context of mindfulness, we're talking about awareness of what's happening right now, both internally and externally. Lots of us have experience with being aware of what's happening externally, using our five senses to sort of get along in the world. It's necessary for our survival. What we may not have as much practice with, though, is what's happening internally, what's happening inside of you in any particular moment. But what's happening inside of you is also having an impact on your experiences and what's happening in the world. So mindfulness is a way to access that. Some of present moment awareness also is about letting go of what's happened in the past, as well as letting go of what's to come in the future, because truthfully, we only have control over what is happening right now. In addition, focusing on what's happened in the past or projecting out into the future is an energy suck, is how I describe it. The emotional centers in your brain don't distinguish between a thought of what's happening or something that is going to happen and then a thing actually happening. So an example of that is perhaps you're a law student on this webinar and you're thinking maybe you're 1L and you're thinking about your grades, or you're worried about getting a job for the summer. And so with mindfulness, the idea is to, rather than worry about the grades or about getting the job, you're focused on what it is you can do right now in this moment to affect what happens in the future. So focusing on your coursework, learning the material, focusing your energy on what you can control right now. The non-judgmental focus piece is how I describe as staying focused on or staying open to possibilities. So when we're in judgment, and as lawyers, we certainly have a lot of experience with judgment, we're labeling things, our thoughts, our emotions, things that are happening in the external world as good or bad, or right or wrong, urgent or not urgent. And certainly that's useful, again, for getting along in the world. But I argue that we often jump to conclusions and judgments that are not necessarily beneficial, but are certainly consequential. So this is particularly important in my work as a diversity and inclusion professional, just to provide you an example, because judgment is what happens when we are acting based upon our unconscious biases that have real consequences on what happens in our interactions with other, and can have systemic consequences as well. If we can stay open to the possibility that someone, ourselves, some situation is not exactly as we have immediately interpreted it, then we may be able to overcome some of those biases, or at least interrupt the biases in terms of how they impact our behavior. You're going to hear a lot more from my fellow panelists momentarily about why, especially for lawyers, mindfulness can be particularly useful. But I'll just offer that focusing on the present moment and doing so with a certain openness to possibilities can provide you with a lot of information beyond what you can get from just sort of interacting with the world on an automatic basis. And information is powerful for problem solvers, which is what lawyers are and what you do as law students, or what you're learning to do as law students.
Thank you so much, Denise. That was a really great overview. And I think it would be really helpful if you introduced a short practice so that we can all experience what you're talking about.
Sure, absolutely. So I'm going to guide you through a short and widely used practice. In fact, it is referenced in one of Professor Magee's articles that we have in the resource list that you have access to through this webinar. The practice is called STOP. It stands for S-T-O-P, and I'm just going to take you through the different steps of this particular practice. So to start, I simply invite you to do nothing else but listen. And you might close your eyes or just focus on something that is grounded or stable, not moving, and to simply stop doing anything and allow yourself to be. And then the next step, the T, is to take a conscious breath. And what we mean by that is to take a full breath in. And what happens with our breath sometimes when we're stressed is that it gets very shallow. That's just a physiological response to stress, and very often we may not even be aware that that response is happening, that our breath has become shallow because we may be in a chronic stress condition. And so I'm just going to offer a tool that I share with my yoga students as you take a conscious breath, and that is to place a hand or both hands on your abdomen or around your lower ribs, and simply begin to breathe in fully, so much so that you feel your abdomen rise or your ribs expand. And then, of course, they'll fall or soften when you breathe out. And you can do that a couple of times because this is a practice, so it takes some practice, it takes some doing. And then the next step is to observe your sensations, physical sensations in your body, feelings of warmth, tingling, etc. Even observing your thoughts rather than being caught up in a particular thought. What's happening perhaps externally as well. And to do this observation with a non-judgmental focus, which means, as we discussed before, trying not to label what you observe in your physical sensation or your thoughts as good or bad. Just allow it to be whatever it is, moving on to the next thing that you notice. And then finally we have P, which is to proceed with awareness. And that is the awareness that I talked about earlier, where when you're present, you have access to more information than you get when you're on automatic pilot, which is useful for problem solving.
What I like about this practice is that you can do it anytime, any place. Is that right, Denise?
That's exactly right. Really simple. Hopefully you can remember the acronym STOP. Very relevant to exactly what it means to just take a moment to observe yourself, take a breath, and then proceed with awareness.
Okay, thank you so much. So let's move on now to our second topic, which is why practice mindfulness. And there's a lot of empirical research in neuroscience and psychology that shows that there are personal, interpersonal, or relational, and systemic benefits to mindfulness. So I'd like to talk now about how these apply to lawyers and law students, and focusing in particular on cognition, emotional regulation, social engagement, and overall well-being, because I thought those were areas that really would be of interest to people who are participating in the webinar. So let's move to the next slide, and I'd like to now turn to Rhonda Magee. Could you talk to us, please, about some of the benefits of mindfulness for lawyers and law students, and perhaps focus on how present moment awareness can help in these areas?
Yes, certainly. And again, thanks to everybody on the call for taking the time to be present to this conversation. I guess what I'm going to say here is only going to touch upon a mountain of research that's out there that helps us all get a little bit clearer on the science behind what we're talking about. So there are like a broad range of studies that have given us reason to be confident that these practices, whereby we focus our attention with a certain kind of attention or intention, if you will, to be present, to attend to our experience in the present, and with an attitude of friendly acceptance of what is happening in the moment. That intention, that attitude, and then the commitment to being present, to attending, is really another way of thinking about what mindfulness is about. And as Denise has already so well presented, there are many ways that these practices have been introduced into the mainstream. I too am a practitioner and teacher of mindfulness-based stress reduction, and so I know that a lot of the research has been based on studies of that particular approach to introducing mindfulness, an 8-week kind of sustained introduction to the practice in a group setting. So I just mentioned that to say that a fair amount of the research, certainly not all of it, but a lot of the research that I feel confident in referring to has been based on studies of folks who have participated in some version or another of that mindfulness-based stress reduction program. But there are more and more of those studies. The studies are being based on modifications of that, are not focused on necessarily people who've had a full 8 weeks of training, nor on people who who have devoted 40 minutes a day or even 20 minutes a day. More and more of the studies are showing benefits from short periods of practice, 5 to 10 minutes each day. But the kinds of things, yes, that we've seen include, of course, increased focus, increased capacity for a range of cognitive capabilities to be refined. So when we say increased focus, that has to do with, again, what we've been talking about, bringing ourselves again and again into the present moment and developing practice with that. I mean, it's called practice for a reason. But by doing that, inviting the mind, sort of really engaging in a practice whereby on a regular basis you really allow as at least part of your mindfulness practice. And again, we could talk more about different ways that one can engage mindfulness practice. But certainly a part of it has to do with the practice that Denise just guided us in, pausing, bringing ourselves into the present, and through that focus, building a sense of calm, ability to concentrate the mind, to settle the mind. So that concentrative dimension of the mindfulness practice which is sort of the door in, if you are looking at the stop practice that we just went through, when we stop, right, and take a conscious breath. By conscious breath, we're really saying focus in on, bring your awareness to the sensations of breathing in and out, letting the mind rest on those sensations. So as there might be thoughts arising or emotions arising with mindfulness practice, you want again and again come back to what does it feel like just to be breathing and embodied breathing being, right? So what does it feel like to sit with my feet on the floor and breathe in and out? Just really noticing those sensations and letting the mind rest just on that. Doing that again and again builds a certain kind of capacity to concentrate the mind on an object of awareness like the breath. So that practice then can be brought to bear on focusing on other objects of awareness, whether it be noting what kinds of thoughts you have that are repetitive and maybe increasing your sense of stress, and choosing to shift your focus in terms of your repetitive thinking, or whether it be noticing what kinds of emotions arise when you sit. So mindfulness is the practice of bringing your attention to a given object of awareness. It need not only be the sensations of breathing, but with that practice that does come the increased ability to do that on call, to allow the mind, when it chooses, to really focus in on something, so that we, whether we're lawyers or law students or law professors, we can, read and comprehend something more effectively. We're not reading the same page 2 or 3 times because as we're reading, thoughts arose and we found ourselves distracted. So it helps deal with distraction, not only by, again, giving yourself the practice of that, but there's something called neuroplasticity, where researchers in neuroscience have shown us that the mind actually, regions of the brain have been shown to respond to mindfulness by reorganizing their structures, so that if you practice, not only are you sort of getting the experience of what it's like to be in concentration, but you're actually reshaping parts of the brain that support being able to do that more easily over time. And so, yes, studies have shown decreases in stress of all sorts, and increases in well-being as a result of these practices, including a decreased sense of loneliness, research has shown. And again, many more of us are experiencing loneliness today than, despite all the connectivity in our lives with our devices and such. Lots of research has shown that many people in America, whether they be clients, whether they be students, whether they be other lawyers, are experiencing effects of stress and loneliness at high levels, and even depression and anxiety is mentioned here. And there, again, a variety of studies have indicated that mindfulness practices are important personal technologies for reducing depression and dealing more effectively with anxiety, certainly fostering compassion and altruism. And as has been mentioned, there are studies that show mindfulness decreases bias, helps deal with bias if we are maybe the target of bias or stereotyping. There are studies that show that these practices can help inoculate us from the kind of performance decrements that can come with being a target of bias. So, and that, how that happens has to do, links up, I think, with some of the ways that, yes, mindfulness, again, allows you to choose and come back to the present moment, minimizes the likelihood of being emotionally hijacked, right? So embedded in some of these findings are some of the other findings, right, that are about how mindfulness helps us with regulation of emotion, with really developing more of a capacity to transform, say, a sense of fear or anxiety into a sense of calm, centeredness on one's strengths and capacities that can minimize the disruptive effects of bias or other kinds of distractions in our day. And so that's just a really brief thumbnail sketch of some of the ways that the research supports us in feeling confident that if we take the time to regularly practice, and again, It's not going to happen just by sitting on a webinar, but if one were, you know, the studies do provide a lot of support for opening up the space in our lives to devote a regular amount of time. It could be just as short as 5 minutes a day, but you know, 5, 10, 15 minutes a day, and again, seeing what works, has been shown to improve our cognitive, our emotional intelligence, social intelligence, our interpersonal skills, right, so that we can listen and speak more effectively with others. Just a whole host of the kinds of skills and capacities that are important to us as lawyers, as leaders, law students, and as human beings generally.
Well, thank you so much. That was very comprehensive, and I'm particularly hopeful about the implications for how mindfulness practices may help to address some of the wellness issues that lawyers are confronting. For example, there's been a lot lately written about the high incidence of alcoholism and depression, particularly relative to other professions. Mm-hmm. So I think this is something that we really do need to pay attention to.
Yes.
Martha, I'd like to get your views on the benefits as a practicing attorney, and I know that you've spoken to students at your law school about the importance of pausing and taking an observer role to one's career path. The observer or witness perspective of self is central to many mindfulness practices, and I'm hoping that you'll be able to tell us from your perspective why it's important to pause and to gain insight into what's really meaningful to you in your practice.
Sure. And first of all, thank you, Susan, for guiding our discussion, and to all the panelists and to everyone for attending. And on this, on the topic of, I guess, pausing to think about your career path, I think it relates to something that Denise mentioned earlier, waking up from life on automatic. And I just think that as you progress through law school and then into your career as a lawyer, you wind up having a lot of responsibilities, and that's a great thing for a lot of reasons, but you can also just get really busy, and because of that, it can be easy to lose sight of the bigger picture. So in law school, your attention could be fully consumed by different projects and deadlines, and that kind of continues in practice. What I was saying, I guess, at the law school when I've spoken to students there was just that, you know, you can get stuck in this tunnel vision, and if you don't take the time every so often to pause and think about what it is you're doing and why, time can just fly by in this blur of stuff, and before you know it, you've met a bunch of deadlines, and you may have accomplished a lot, but you may have lost track of why and what's the purpose of doing all this stuff. And I find that your whole attitude just changes and becomes healthier, and in fact it makes you more able to meet your responsibilities if you take some time to reflect on the bigger picture and to find a sense of meaning.
Meaning and purpose. I completely agree. I wanted to just touch briefly before we move on to the next segment here. Going back to you, Rhonda, to just ask you about the relational and systemic benefits. I know that you've written recently about how being more aware of our interconnectedness is a foundation for social justice work and reducing inequality, and I just wanted to be sure to touch on that a little bit at this point in the presentation.
Thank you so much. Right, I think a lot of attention when we've turned to mindfulness is focused, and I think rightfully actually, on the personal dimensions of it, right? As we've been talking about here, some of the ways that these practices can assist us as individuals in handling the stress of our lives. Just as Martha was just saying, and Denise had said earlier, shaking us out of autopilot, and that's very that speaks to a very personal level commitment to making time again for practice, as I mentioned before, and then really sort of bringing it into our everyday lives. But there are dimensions of the practices that, as I alluded to before, and I think even the comments that everyone's made suggest implicitly, if not explicitly, that are about an interpersonal dimension, right? So what is mindfulness if it does not in some way assist us in the engagements that by which our lives are made meaningful, the relationships, right, that we have in our personal, professional, and other dimensions of our lives. So there are again, I think this aspect of the research is somewhat nascent. We need more of it, but there certainly are studies that have shown and are continuing to show the some of the interpersonal benefits of mindfulness. So I already alluded to mindful communication practices, and we could do a whole series of webinars on really that as a source of what could be our practice in law and in legal professionalism, right? So just how we communicate and how mindfulness can assist us in communicating more effectively, a very interpersonal piece, but also how we attend to the kind of social and emotional landscape that's always present in communication. Mindfulness practices can certainly assist us with those. And we can say more about the interpersonal dimension, but for me, there's the personal, there's the interpersonal practice, and specific practices we can use to enhance all of those aspects of our lives. And then there's a systemic piece, which as I have been writing more about, because I think, again, if we tend to think of mindfulness as a personal practice and maybe every once in a while sort of think about not only interpersonal dimensions of personal practice, but how there are interpersonal practices that we could engage in together. There are, I think, many of us, Angela Harris, a professor at UC Davis here in California, and there are others, have really been interested in social justice and improving not only our personal well-being or the relationships that we personally engage in, but really finding ways to bring mindfulness into the world in service of helping minimize the problems that we see. And so if we have time, I'll engage us in a practice that I think is one of the ways that we can move from the personal practice of mindfulness into a deeper felt interconnectedness with the broader environment in which we sit, and begin to see better the ways that practices that we can engage in as subgroups, as systems of folks who are engaged in work to change the world, can be of benefit to us in a broader sense, right? To the degree that we not only want to enhance our own well-being, and that's very important, and our own capacity to function effectively and to be stellar in the work that we do. I know many of us, people are on this call partly because you also care about making a difference in the world. And so that piece that's about really looking at mindfulness as a ground for ethical behavior in the world, problem solving that includes everyone, that sees the nuanced interconnectedness between a problem over here, as I wrote about in a recent article for the ABA Journal, seeing the interconnectedness between excessive use of force and police community mistrust as a significant issue, as we all know in our communities today, on the one hand, and a broader way in which our society has tended to become a little bit less committed to a sense of the public good. A broader way in which we are all so personally besieged in many ways that we have missed opportunities to connect across lines of real and perceived differences, to bring communities together. So, I'm only touching on in this brief moment a broader set of kind of interest, commitments, practices that I've been focusing on personally in the teaching and the presentations that I do, and in the work that I do to advise organizations around the country, like the Center for Mindfulness, which developed mindfulness-based stress reduction, but other organizations that are leaders in this field. I've been working to help open the door, the research door, and among others, to looking at the way these practices can benefit us on all of those levels, the personal, the interpersonal, and the structural, systemic in our search for a better world for us all.
Right. Right. These possibilities are so exciting, and I do feel like we're at the cutting edge of the research in this area. And this is a good segue into something else I wanted to talk about, because mindfulness really applies to many areas that are central to the practice of law, including ethics and civility. And I wanted to ask you, Martha, to talk to us a little bit about, in your practice and perhaps in your professional responsibility course, do you find that mindfulness can help bring intentionality to particular conduct? And what I'm talking about really is, the application of reflection and self-awareness to enhance decision making, and perhaps that this will help you in difficult situations or challenging conversations, the kinds of things that arise regularly for practicing lawyers.
Sure, and I should say that I am just only now kind of learning about mindfulness, and so it's a fairly new area to me. So I guess to this point I haven't really had any type of formal mindfulness practice, but a lot of the concepts I think are helpful, and I think that a lot of lawyers that I can think of and who I really admire, I've seen kind of these concepts reflected in a lot of the things that they do. And so one example I would say is it relates to this area of professionalism and civility. Just on that topic, there is this book chapter that I saw recently, and that's in our list of resources today. The chapter is called Mindfulness and Professionalism, and it's by Jan Jacobowitz in the book Essential Qualities of the Professional Lawyer. And that chapter kind of talks about these concepts of civility and how it's helpful to civility for a lawyer to develop habits that help the lawyer to kind of notice and pause and to respond to things more intentionally and carefully, rather than to just have an emotional reaction. And I guess just one kind of practical example to try and make it a little more concrete, I have a colleague who I think really embodies this, and he does a great job of diffusing tense conversations. So if, for example, every once in a while you get into a tense conversation potentially with opposing counsel, and he's wonderful at kind of diffusing those. And I used to wonder what it was that he was doing, and I think basically he's implementing this type of notice and pause concept. Just listening carefully and letting opposing counsel know that that he listened and he heard their concerns, and trying to even repeat back to them, having heard you, let me say what I think I understand your concerns are, and then please let me know if I've understood you correctly. And really trying to reflect back the concerns they've expressed. And that can be, I think, a really good way of kind of diffusing some tension and allowing everyone to move forward.
Right. So it's really taking this concept of the importance of being present and using it to enhance your active listening skills. I like that. I think that's very, very helpful. Okay, why don't we move ahead now to our third topic, which is how to cultivate mindfulness. But before we do that, let's take another audience poll. So does your law school or workplace offer mindfulness-focused classes or programs? And you can vote here.
Also, just a reminder to attendees, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the questions panel. If we have time, we'll get to them. Okay. Those results should be popping up on your screen now.
The results are up. It's interesting because only 15% are saying yes. And I do know that mindfulness is being introduced to students at several law schools. At GW Law, we've incorporated mindfulness into our Inns of Court professional development program. And the session that we had this school year that Denise presented for us It was focused on mindfulness as a strategy for optimizing focus and concentration. Some of our faculty, Professors Todd Peterson and Karen Thornton, are opening their class sessions with short practices. And the students really enjoy that and appreciate it. Todd Peterson does this at every single civil procedure course for the entire year. So he's very committed to this. And I'm hoping that other schools and workplaces will take a lesson from that and consider adopting some kind of mindfulness focus in their environment. So we can move ahead to the next slide about cultivating mindfulness. And I really like this image because it shows how many paths there are to cultivating mindfulness. And Denise, I'd like you to tell us a little bit more about this tree, if you will.
Absolutely. So this is one of my favorite illustrations of contemplative practice, and it comes from an organization that I believe Rhonda referenced earlier, the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society, which focuses on using contemplative and introspective practices in higher education, in particular, in furtherance of a more just society. So much of what Rhonda spoke about earlier is very much in line with what they do, and in fact, I know that she has been very involved with that organizations. They have developed this tree that you see here to really show that contemplative practices, which I should explain, are about finding what is meaningful, which we've heard a number of different, described in a number of different ways today, and its connection, the contemplative practices and the connection to mindfulness is that I describe mindfulness as being sort of the goal of contemplative practices. So by engaging in these practices, you're able to identify what is meaningful and to make space for or have a focus that allows for more presence. And what's cool about this tree, in my opinion, is that it reveals for us that there are a lot of different paths for developing the capacity for mindfulness or to practice in many different ways. So as Rhonda noted earlier, which is absolutely right, a lot of the research that has been done with respect to mindfulness is in the area of meditation, mindfulness meditation in particular, and then maybe to a lesser extent yoga as a practice. But there are many different other sort of paths to get to that sort of present moment awareness with the non-judgmental focus, and I think this illustration does a wonderful way of doing that. And also you'll see that there's space for practicing in a way that speaks to sort of who you are, and that can change over time. So for example, you'll see that some of these practices are relational. That might be particularly attractive to those of you who are, more extroverted, who may need to be in connection with others in order to reflect and to sort of restore, and part of your well-being, part of being well for you may be a more relational thing, so you'll see some practices reflected here for that. And then for people who are like me, who are very sort of, who learn by doing, very kinesthetic, and frankly need more physical practices in order to get outside of our heads, there are things like yoga and other movement practices that can be particularly helpful. And I think, again, this is just a helpful illustration of the many different ways in which we can get to kind of the objective of being able to be more present and to be more open to possibility. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Susan.
Great, thank you. Rhonda, I know you teach some classes in this area, and I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about some of the ways that you bring mindfulness into your classroom.
Yes. So, yeah, I've been experimenting with bringing mindfulness into a variety of traditional law school spaces for years. And so there's a number of different ways I've done it. I'll speak about three. So one, I teach a traditional torts class. And so like as Susan mentioned, happens in her law school, I and several other professors actually open our classes. We will open our classes with moments of mindfulness, whether or not we explicitly name them as such. We invite the class members to kind of bring themselves consciously into the classroom, to transition into the space, and we provide a few minutes of silent opportunity for reflection. If they want to use it just to look over their notes, that's fine. But the idea is that we open our classes, of several of us at the University of San Francisco, whether we're teaching torts or property law, with these mindful moments. And that's one way of just sort of gently dropping mindfulness into a kind of a more traditional space. Again, whether you name it or not, most people tend to appreciate having a little bit more space at the beginning of a meeting, at the beginning of a class. It's sort of amazing. I've worked with judges who have been incorporating this kind of space into some of their calendars, right? Some of the work they do in the courtroom. So that's one way. Another way is that I've worked with a number of other folk. Judy Cohen, some of you may know her work with an organization she's founded called Warrior One. But prior to doing that, she was an adjunct professor who's teaching at USF. I was there as another professor there who's a former Jesuit priest, actually, USF being a Jesuit law school. The three of us got together, and we were drawn together by this desire to bring a contemplative dimension into the curriculum. And we co-created a course that we have modified. I've certainly modified over the years, but we still have been teaching since, 2009. I believe every semester, some version of our course, we call it contemplative lawyering, or I've taught a version of the course at Berkeley. I call it, there we call it something like effective and sustainable law practice, a mindfulness-based approach. But the bottom line is that we make explicit the way that we will be bringing mindfulness practice into the class on a regular basis. Each class will have an experiential dimension as well as a smaller kind of lecture or in conversational dimension, where we focus on the particular skills of lawyering, right? So the cognitive dimension that we talked about before, how important it is for lawyers to be able to concentrate. So we provide a grounding in concentrative mindfulness-based practices. The embodiment practice, the pieces that Denise just alluded to about how it is that being more present in the body and having support for what we call mindful movement, but basically it's some yoga with a small y as opposed to a capital Y, but it's really seeing that mindfulness and yoga have a lot in common. Yoga focuses on bringing mindfulness into, again, the embodied movements that we might engage in. And so in the class on contemplative lawyering, we help centralize this idea that one might bring an awareness that begins with maybe a mindful sitting and concentration practice into all the movements of our day. And this can help us be more aware of tension that's forming in our bodies, can help us deal with anxiety as we get ready to prepare for an oral argument, et cetera, et cetera. And then we also look at the communication dimensions I've already alluded to that are skills that lawyers need to be able to master. And so we bring in specific practices that assist with that interpersonal communication dimension of skill building. So basically we have identified specific, and I'm only alluding to some of them here, but specific skills that we know lawyers need and have linked specific practices to the development of those particular skills. And we create space as well for the broader professional identity and professionalism issues that we've been alluding to here as well. So that's what a very thumbnail sketch of what a contemplative law class is like. And finally, I've developed a class that really looks at some of the issues that Denise and I have both been alluding to on the call, all of us in some ways, the broader social justice questions that a lot of our students are interested in. The particular class that I'm teaching and have taught now for the second year in a row is, it's called Intro to Race and Law, Policies, Practices, and Professionalism. But right on the syllabus, I can make a commitment to introducing mindfulness practices as a support for learning the substance of the legal history around race and law as it has shown up in constitutional context and immigration contexts. And we learn how to process in the class the emotions that come up. So we're marrying the cognitive work with these awareness practices in a way that supports students in being able to speak more effectively about these issues, advocate for what they think needs to be brought to the fore around this dimension of justice and practice as they may be seeing it in the world. So those are just 3 class settings or 3 examples of the ways that I brought it into formal classes, but I've also worked to bring it in co-curricular, in a co-curricular way as well. So drop-in meditation sessions on the one hand, many courses on mindfulness on the other. So no credit, but just a commitment to 4 weeks where we meet in a group and we practice and we develop this idea of practicing on a regular basis together. So those are just some of the ways that I brought a commitment to infusing legal education with mindfulness and continuing legal education, as I offer these to lawyers as well, but into those more traditional spaces.
Well, thank you. Your students are very fortunate. I think that they should be very appreciative of everything that you're doing for them, and you have a very nice way of weaving all of these different components together. I want to take another opportunity to speak to you, Martha, about how you incorporate mindfulness practice into your day as a busy litigator. And I know that it can be very informal, even if it hasn't been you know, a conscious practice on your part. But perhaps you could tell us a little bit about what you've done informally.
Yeah, so you know, one thing I think that helps, and this gets to what Rhonda was saying with the trying to build the ability to concentrate, which is so important as a lawyer. One thing that I found helpful is just to take a very short walk sometimes. You know, if you've been working for some time and you're losing focus, just take a walk, and even if it's a few minutes. And sometimes I'll try to actively like observe, hopefully something natural. I live in the city, but there's a ginkgo tree that's a couple blocks from my office. So sometimes I just go see like how the leaves are doing in the fall. It's really beautiful. And if you just pay attention to the details of some tree nearby, for some reason I find it helps when I get back in front of my computer. I am able to focus better. And I'm sure there are different things that work for different people, but something like that I've found pretty helpful. Or reading just for a few minutes some book that is uplifting and that requires paying attention. So something that hopefully has some substance to it and helps you concentrate a little bit, just for a couple minutes. I found that helpful too. And then getting back to this concept of notice and pause. Sometimes I'll write an email and then just save the draft and then come back to it sometime later and not hit send immediately, and just I found that helpful as well.
I think that is the most practical advice we've heard, because how many of us have sent emails too hastily? So thank you very much for adding that. I want to have some time for questions before we wrap up. Many of the questions that people have been sending in have been answered throughout the presentation. One thing that we have not touched upon, and perhaps Denise, you could answer this for us, can you make any recommendations about apps or podcasts to assist people with mindfulness practice?
Sure. So there are many, and I certainly don't want to, please don't take this as an endorsement of any particular, brand of apps or podcasts. But I guess let me start with the general and say that if you are interested in starting a mindfulness practice, particularly a mindfulness meditation or any type of meditation practice, I do think it is helpful to be guided, at least as a start, and then, then you can sort of, with some practice, you can move on to doing it on your own. And so I think that's where different apps like, for example, Headspace is an app that I know that has been talked about a lot, sort of mainstream-wise, and people seem to very much like. And I am a particular fan of podcasts, which, you tend to get a bit of a longer and more varied guided meditations from different teachers, which is something that I'm a particular fan of, because you can find that, and I find this also in my yoga practice, you'll learn something different from every teacher, just like, in law school or in your practice, when you think about your mentors and the different ways in which you learn from different individuals. So there are a number of different podcasts. If you have an iPhone, on the podcast app, I am a fan of Hay House, which is a particular channel, if you will, or station that has weekly guided meditations from a variety of individuals. The Chopra Center is also very well known, started by Deepak Chopra. They have a number of different, if you go to their website, a number of different guided meditations as well. So the bottom line is that I think if you're new to this, particularly in the meditation space, going to a class even, there's certainly nothing wrong with, and I am very much an advocate of going in person somewhere to learn how to engage in these practices. And then the last thing I'll mention on this point, which is just to dovetail off of what Martha said, which I think is so important, is to find a way to integrate these practices, whichever ones work for you, into what you're doing already, because you're more likely, just like with exercise, to do it if you are sort of integrating it into your your everyday life. So Martha's example of taking a break, taking a walk, outside the office, but not feeling like you necessarily have to go to a particular place in order to engage in these practices. I think it really helps with the sustainability of them, which is what you need in order to get the benefits over time.
Right. No, that's an excellent point. We have compiled some suggested.
May I just add a
Go ahead.
Okay,
Sure.
thank you. Apologize just for talking over for just that moment, but there is another app that many people have found useful, again, not an endorsement, but from experience. It's called Insight Timer, INSIGHT, so Insight Timer, and it has, both the passage of time, meditations with beautiful bells and gongs that sort of kind of bring you in and out, but it, as mentioned before, has some guided meditations of a wide variety, and it also has a little bit of a social networking or connectivity function, because it enables you, if you're interested, to see who's meditating, to kind of share some of your experiences with others, etc. And I know people who found that helpful as well.
Well, thank you for that. I was not familiar with that particular app. We do have some resources that we've compiled for you. We've collected them, selected resources on the next slide, and then we have additional resources in the handout that's available. And I think we need to wrap up now. We've had a chance to hear from all of the panelists, but one thing that might be really nice to do as we close, Rhonda, if you would be interested, you had alluded to leading us in another short practice. Could we try, as we wrap up, a loving kindness meditation?
Yes. Thank you.
Sure.
So if everyone who's willing could just take a moment to consciously bring your attention to the sensations of sitting, if you're sitting, if you're standing. Most of you are probably sitting, so just notice the position of the body in the chair, feet on the floor, and bring your awareness to just drop into the sensations of sitting and breathing in and breathing out. And I'll offer these few phrases, a modification of a longer meditation called the loving kindness meditation that assists us in bringing a sense of well-being to ourselves and to others. And it invites you to inwardly recite these following phrases, quietly first perhaps to yourself. May I be filled with loving kindness. May I be well in body and in mind. May I be safe from inner and outer danger. May I be truly happy and free. And just gently, as we sit together, if we can expand that sense of the wish for loving kindness, for well-being, expanding it from our own self to take it into ourselves, but allow it to touch everyone on this call. And if you can imagine allowing the rippling out, sensing into the rippling out of all that we may meet today, each of us, and around the worlds in which we interact, a wish for loving kindness. May you all be well.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for this interesting and mindful conversation. I really appreciate you all being here with us today. I'm going to turn this now back over to Bill from the ABA to wrap up.
Sure. Thanks, Susan, and thank you to our panel and for everybody who attended today's webinar. Attendees, you'll receive a recording of the webinar tomorrow in an email. You'll get an email with a link to the recording. And be sure to join us for next month's webinar, Finding Long-Term Career Satisfaction Through Career Fit with Dr. Larry Richard. If you check abalcc.org in a couple of hours, you'll be able to register for that. And also, if you have a moment, please take the time to complete our short post-webinar survey. It helps us plan future programming and identify any sort of technical issues or that participants might experience. And yeah, thanks, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.